Sometimes the most honorable people are the ones the world has forgotten. James Mitchell knows what it means to serve his country with pride, only to find himself abandoned on the cold streets 3 years later. At 62, this decorated army sergeant sits at a downtown bus stop on a bitter February morning. His worn military jacket offers little protection from the wind as commuters hurry past his cardboard sign. That's when he spots a leather wallet in the slush, thick with cash that could change his life forever. Inside are $50,000 in crisp hundreds and a business card for Richard Whitmore, a powerful millionaire CEO. James stares at more money than he's seen in years, enough to get off the streets, find an apartment, maybe reconnect with his daughter. But what happens when a man who has lost everything finds the one thing that could save him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning ritual never changed. James Mitchell woke at 5:30 a.m. in the Mercy House shelter, his internal clock still set to military time after all these years. His fingers automatically reached beneath his threadbare shirt to touch the cold metal dog tags that hung against his chest. Sergeant James M. Mitchell, U.S. Army, blood type O positive. They were the only proof left of the man he used to be. Around him, 30 other men stirred in their narrow cots. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, disinfectant, and despair that no amount of cleaning could eliminate. James folded his thin blanket with the same precision he'd once used for his military bunk, corners sharp enough to bounce a quarter. Some habits die hard, even when everything else about your life has crumbled to dust. "Morning, Sergeant," whispered Tommy Rodriguez, a younger veteran who occupied the cot next to his. Tommy had lost his right leg to an IED in Afghanistan and walked with a prosthetic that clicked softly against the concrete floor. "You headed to the usual spot?" James nodded, pulling on his worn boots. The leather was cracked and water-stained, but they still had good solace. "The 7:15 crowd's usually good for a few dollars," he said quietly, not wanting to wake the others. "Need to get to the library before it closes. They've got computers." They'd been sending out job applications from the public library for months, though the responses were always the same. No address meant no job. No job meant no address. It was a cycle that seemed impossible to break, especially for a man his age with a 3-year gap in employment history that he couldn't explain without revealing his homelessness. The morning air hit him like a slap as he stepped outside the shelter. February, and the city was brutal, with a wind that cut through clothing and found every gap in your defenses. James pulled his military jacket tighter around his chest. The green canvas was faded now, the sergeant's stripes barely visible, but it was warm, and it reminded him of better days. His usual corner was at the intersection of 5th and Main, right by the bus stop where downtown workers waited for their rides to the business district. James had learned that timing was everything. Too early, and you caught people rushing to work, stressed and avoiding eye contact. Too late, and you missed the morning crowd entirely. But right around 7:15, there was a sweet spot where people had time to notice, time to feel something. He unfolded his cardboard sign, "Homeless Veteran. Anything helps. God bless," and settled onto the cold, concrete bench. The sign was getting soft from moisture and handling, the black marker bleeding slightly. But it told his truth simply, and without drama. The commuters began arriving in their steady stream. Designer suits, polished shoes, coffee cups steaming. In the cold air, most avoided his eyes, but James had learned not to take it personally. It wasn't about him, it was about their own discomfort with a reality they didn't know how to process. A few regulars knew him by now. Mrs. Chun, who worked at the bank, usually dropped a $5 bill in his cup with a kind nod. The young lawyer with the red briefcase always apologized that he only carried cards, But he'd stopped to ask how James was doing, and that meant something to Dot. It was 7:43 when James first noticed the wallet. He'd been watching a businessman juggle his phone, coffee, and newspaper when something brown caught his eye near the curb. There, half hidden by dirty slush and yesterday's newspaper, was a leather wallet. Rich brown leather, the kind that cost more than James used to spend on groceries in a month. James looked around. The businessman was gone, disappeared into the crowd. No one else seemed to have noticed the wallet. People hurried past, focused on their phones or the approaching bus, stepping around the small object without seeing it. For a long moment, James just stared. In 3 years on the streets, he developed a philosophy about found items. Loose change belonged to whoever found it, the universe's small gifts to those who needed them most. But wallets were different. Wallets held pieces of people's lives. The bus arrived with a hydraulic wheeze, disgorging passengers and swallowing others. In the commotion, James made his decision. He stood slowly, his knees protesting the cold, and walked over to the wallet. His hands were steady as he picked it up, muscle memory from years of handling sensitive equipment in the field. The leather was soft and expensive, barely worn. As he opened it, James felt his breath catch in his throat. The wallet was thick with cash, more cash than he'd seen in years. $100 bills, crisp and new, filled every slot. His fingers shook slightly as he counted. 500. 1,000. 2,000. The numbers kept climbing. $50,000. James closed his eyes and took a deep breath. $50,000 was more money than he'd made in the last 5 years combined. It was enough to get off the streets, find an apartment, buy decent clothes for job interviews. It was enough to maybe, just maybe, get his life back. Behind the cash, he found a driver's license with the photo of a distinguished man in his 50s. Silver hair, perfectly styled, confident smile. Richard Whitmore, age 54, address in the wealthy Harbor District. There were credit cards, platinum and black cards that James recognized as the kind reserved for the very wealthy, and business cards in an elegant script. Richard Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer, Whitmore Industries. James had heard of Whitmore Industries. They own half the commercial real estate downtown, including the building where he'd tried to apply for a security guard position just last month. They'd turned him away at the lobby, saying they weren't hiring, though he'd seen the help wanted sign still hanging in the window when he left. Sitting back down on his bench, James stared at the wallet in his hands. This Richard Whitmore lived in a world James could barely imagine, a world of drivers and business dinners, of decisions that affected thousands of people, of never having to worry about where the next meal would come from or where to sleep. When the temperature dropped below freezing, the practical side of his mind, the part that had learned harsh lessons about survival on the streets, whispered seductive possibilities. Who would know? The money could have blown away in the wind, been picked up by anyone. Richard Whitmore probably had insurance, probably wouldn't even miss $50,000. Rich people lost more than that in a day on the stock market. But beneath his worn jacket, the dog tags pressed against his chest, cold and familiar. They reminded him of who he used to be, of the oath he'd taken when he first put on the uniform. Honor wasn't something you wore on the outside. It was something you carried inside, something that didn't change just because your circumstances did. James Mitchell had been a lot of things: husband, father, soldier, leader of men. He'd made mistakes, plenty of them, mistakes that had cost him everything he'd once held dear. But he'd never been a thief. And 3 years of sleeping in shelters and begging for change hadn't changed that fundamental part of who he was. Across town, in a glass office 40 floors above the city, Richard Whitmore was discovering his own crisis. He'd been reaching for his wallet to pay for lunch when he realized it was gone. The realization hit him like a physical blow, not because of the money, though $50,000 in cash was significant, but because of what else the wallet contained. Photos of his daughter, business cards from important contacts, and most importantly, the small piece of paper with his cardiologist's private number, scheduled for a call that afternoon about test results he'd been dreading. Richard's world was built on control, on having systems and backup plans for everything. But now, standing in his mahogany-paneled office with its view of the harbor, he felt helpless in a way he hadn't experienced since childhood. He'd already called his bank to cancel the credit cards, but the cash was gone, and with it, pieces of his life that couldn't be replaced with a phone call. His assistant, Margaret, knocked softly on his door. She'd been with Whitmore Industries for 15 years, long enough to recognize when her boss was truly rattled. "Mr. Whitmore? Security is asking if you'd like them to review the building's cameras. They can trace your movements from this morning." Richard nodded, grateful for her efficiency. "Yes, do that. And call Detective Morrison at the downtown precinct. We've donated enough to their benevolent fund over the years. Maybe they can expedite things." But even as he spoke, Richard felt the futility of it. The wallet was probably already in the hands of someone who saw it as a lottery ticket. Someone who wouldn't think twice about spending money that wasn't theirs. In his experience, people generally live down to your expectations, especially when large sums of money were involved. Back at the bus stop, James had made his decision. He carefully placed the wallet in his inside jacket pocket, close to his heart, and stood up. The morning crowd was thinning now, the rush hour giving way to a quieter rhythm. He folded his cardboard sign and tucked it under his arm. There would be no more panhandling today. He had something more important to do. The walk to downtown took 45 minutes, but James didn't mind. He'd learned to appreciate the simple act of walking, of having somewhere to go and something to do. The streets gradually changed as he moved from the shelter district to the business center. Buildings grew taller, people dressed better, and the very air seemed to carry the weight of money and power. Whitmore Industries occupied a sleek glass tower that reflected the sky and clouds, making it seem like a building that existed partially in heaven. James had never been inside, but he'd walked past it many times, marveling at the rushing crowds of well-dressed professionals who disappeared through revolving doors each morning. Now, standing on the sidewalk, looking up at those 40 floors of glass and steel, James felt the weight of the wallet against his chest. Somewhere up there was Richard Whitmore, probably wondering where his wallet had gone, probably assuming it was lost forever. James touched his dog tags one more time, drawing strength from the reminder of who he'd once been and who he still was, despite everything. The revolving door moved smoothly as James entered the lobby, his warm boots silent on the polished marble floor. The security guard looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to barely concealed suspicion as he took in James's appearance. "Can I help you?" The guard's tone was polite but wary. James reached into his jacket and pulled out the wallet, holding it carefully in both hands. "I found this," he said simply. "It belongs to Richard Whitmore. I'd like to return it to him." The security guard's nameplate read Martinez, and his eyes narrowed as he studied James with the practiced assessment of someone trained to spot trouble. James could see the man taking in every detail. The worn military jacket, the weathered face, the careful way he held the expensive wallet like it was made of glass. "You found this?" Martinez asked, his tone suggesting he didn't quite believe it. "At the bus stop on 5th and Main," James replied, his voice steady. "About an hour ago. The business card inside says Mr. Whitmore works here." Martinez gestured for James to step aside from the main flow of traffic. Behind his professional demeanor, James could see the man struggling with the situation. How often did homeless people walk into corporate lobbies carrying wallets full of cash? The guard's training probably covered a lot of scenarios, but this wasn't one of them. "I'll need to verify the contents," Martinez said, pulling out a clipboard. Standard procedure for lost items. James handed over the wallet without hesitation. He watched as Martinez opened it, his eyebrows rising slightly. At the thick stack of bills, the guard's fingers moved carefully through the contents, counting the money, examining the credit cards, checking the driver's license photo against the business cards. "This is significant," Martinez said quietly, closing the wallet. "You could have just kept walking." "I could have," James agreed. "But it doesn't belong to me." Martinez picked up his phone and dialed an extension. "Mr. Whitmore? Security desk. We have someone here who says he found your wallet." There was a pause. Then Martinez looked at James with new interest. "Yes, sir. I'll send him up." The elevator, ride to the 40th floor, gave James time to study his reflection in the polished steel doors. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who'd been living rough for 3 years. His hair needed cutting, his beard needed trimming, and his clothes, while clean, bore the unmistakable signs of long wear and careful maintenance. He wondered what Richard Whitmore would see when he looked at him. The elevator opened onto a reception area that screamed quiet wealth. Thick carpeting, oil paintings on the walls, fresh flowers on a mahogany table. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and perfectly styled gray hair looked up from her desk. "You must be Mr. Mitchell," she said warmly. "I'm Margaret, Mr. Whitmore's assistant. He's very eager to meet you." James felt surprise ripple through him. He hadn't given his name to the security guard. "How did you?" "Mr. Whitmore has been having quite a morning," Margaret explained, leading him toward a set of double doors. "When security called to say someone had found his wallet, he had me research you immediately. We found your military records. Quite impressive, Sergeant." The doors opened to reveal an office that seemed bigger than the entire main floor of the Mercy House shelter. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, and James could see the bus stop where he'd spent his morning, tiny and distant far below. Behind a desk that could have comfortably seated 6 people stood Richard Whitmore. The man was taller than James had expected, with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from a lifetime of being in charge. He wore a suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month, but his eyes, intelligent and probing, were focused entirely on James with an intensity that was both unsettling and oddly respectful. "Mr. Mitchell," Richard said, stepping around his desk with his hand extended. "I understand you found something that belongs to me." James reached into his jacket and pulled out the wallet, holding it out with both hands. "Is this yours?" Richard took the wallet and immediately opened it, his fingers moving through the cash with the quick efficiency of someone accustomed to handling money. James watched his face, saw the moment when the reality hit him. Everything was there, down to the last bill. $50,000, Richard said quietly, looking up at James. "You could have taken this money and disappeared. No one would have known. No one would have blamed you." "I would have known," James replied simply. Richard stared at him for a long moment, and James could see the man's worldview shifting in real time. Here was someone who probably dealt with people every day, who would cut corners, who would take advantage, who would rationalize away their conscience for far less than $50,000. And yet, here stood a homeless veteran who had walked across town to return money that could have changed his life. "Please, sit down," Richard said, gesturing to a leather chair that probably cost more than James's monthly shelter fee. "I have to ask why. I mean, I'm grateful, incredibly grateful, but I have to understand. Why bring it back?" James settled into the chair, which was more comfortable than any bed he'd slept in for years. He looked out the window at the city, spreading below them, thinking about how to explain something that felt as fundamental as breathing. "My father used to tell me that character is what you do when nobody's watching," he said finally. 3 years ago, I lost everything: my house, my family, my job, my reputation. But I never lost who I am at my core. That wallet might have been the answer to a lot of problems, but it would have created a bigger one. I would have had to live with knowing I was a thief. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying James with undisguised fascination. Margaret told me she found your military records. 22 years of service, multiple commendations, Purple Heart recipient. How does someone with your background end up? He paused, clearly struggling with how to phrase the question diplomatically. Homeless? James finished for him. It's not that uncommon, unfortunately. About 11% of homeless adults are veterans. Some of us, the transition back to civilian life doesn't go smoothly. What happened? Richard asked quietly. James was quiet for a long moment. He'd told this story before to social workers and case managers, but never to someone like Richard Whitmore, never in an office like this. There was something about the man's genuine interest, his lack of judgment, that made James want to be completely honest. I came back from my third deployment with what they now call PTSD, though we didn't have a name for it then. I was angry all the time, couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate. I was drinking too much, fighting with my wife about everything and nothing. My daughter was 12, and she was scared of me. I was scared of me. James paused, remembering those dark months when everything fell apart. I got treatment eventually, but the damage was done. My marriage fell apart. I lost my job at the post office, started having trouble keeping work. Without health insurance, I couldn't afford my medications. It's a spiral. Once it starts, it's hard to stop. Richard listened without interrupting, and James found himself sharing more than he'd intended. There was something about this man, this stranger whose wallet he'd returned, that invited confidence. 3 years ago, I lost my apartment, James continued. I'd been staying with friends, couch surfing, but eventually you wear out your welcome. The shelter was supposed to be temporary, just until I got back on my feet. But when you don't have an address, you can't get a job. And when you don't have a job, you can't get an address. It becomes a cycle that's almost impossible to break. Richard was quiet for several minutes, processing what he'd heard. James could see the man's mind working, could almost see him trying to reconcile the articulate, dignified person sitting across from him with his preconceptions about homelessness. I want to give you a reward, Richard said finally, for returning the wallet, something substantial. James shook his head immediately. That's not why I brought it back. I know that's not why you brought it back, Richard said, leaning forward. That's exactly why I want to give you something. Do you understand how rare what you did is? In my world, people compromise their integrity for much less than $50,000. Hell, I've seen board members sell out their principles for a good table at the right restaurant. Mr. Whitmore, James said carefully, I appreciate the offer, I really do. But taking money would change what this was. It would make it a transaction instead of just doing the right thing. Richard stared at him again, and James could see something shifting in the man's expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition. As if he was seeing something in James that he hadn't expected to find. You know, Richard said slowly, I've been in business for 30 years. I've negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars, managed thousands of employees, built companies from the ground up. I don't think anyone has ever impressed me as much as you have in the last 15 minutes. James felt uncomfortable with the praise. I just did what anyone should do. But that's the point, Richard said. Most people wouldn't. Most people would have rationalized it, somehow told themselves I wouldn't miss it, or that they needed it more, or that the universe was giving them a gift. You didn't do that. You saw something that wasn't yours, and you brought it back even, though returning it cost you something significant. The two men sat in silence for a moment, each lost in thought. James was beginning to feel out of place in this luxurious office, aware that he'd accomplished what he came to do and probably ought to leave. but Richard seemed reluctant to let him go. "Can I ask you something?" Richard said. "What's your plan? I mean, what are you hoping to accomplish? Are you looking for work? Housing assistance? What would actually help you get back on your feet?" James considered the question carefully. He'd been asked similar things by social workers and case managers, but something about Richard's tone suggested this wasn't just professional curiosity. "Honestly, I need a job. Everything else flows from that. But it's harder than you might think. Most employers want recent references, a stable address, professional clothes for interviews. When you're homeless, you're starting from a deficit that's hard to overcome." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "What kind of work are you looking for?" "Anything, really. I've got management experience from the military, but I'd be happy with security. Work, maintenance, even janitorial. I'm not proud. I just want to work, to contribute something, to feel useful again." What if I told you that Whitmore Industries is always looking for good people? We've got security positions, facilities management, even some consulting work for someone with your background and experience. James felt his heart rate increase slightly. "Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate the thought, but I don't want charity. If you're offering because you feel obligated." "Stop right there," Richard interrupted. "I didn't build this company by making charity hires. If I offer you a position, it'll be because I think you can do the job and do it well. What you did today tells me more about your character than any interview ever could." Richard stood up and walked to his window, looking down at the city below. "You know what the hardest part of my job is? Finding people I can trust. People with integrity. People who do the right thing even when no one's watching. I deal with employees, contractors, business partners who would sell their grandmother for the right price. And here you are, living in a shelter, and you won't even take $50,000 that fell into your lap." He turned back to James. "I'm going to make you an offer, and I want you to think about it seriously. We have a position in our facilities. Management division overseeing security, maintenance, vendor relationships. It requires someone with leadership experience, someone who can be trusted with responsibility. The pay is decent, there are benefits, and we can help with housing assistance through our employee support program." James felt dizzy. An hour ago, he'd been sitting at a bus stop with a cardboard sign, and now he was being offered a real job by one of the most powerful men in the city. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "Say you'll think about it," Richard replied. "Go back to wherever you're staying, sleep on it, and call me tomorrow. Margaret will give you her direct number." James stood up, feeling unsteady on his feet. "Mr. Whitmore, why are you doing this?" "Really?" Richard smiled, and for the first time since James had entered the office, he looked genuinely relaxed. "Because 30 years in business has taught me that character is the rarest commodity there is. And because maybe, just maybe, we can help each other." James walked back to the shelter in a daze. Richard Whitmore's business card tucked carefully in his shirt pocket next to his dog tags. The afternoon sun felt warmer than it had in months, though he knew that was just his imagination running away with possibility. 3 years of disappointment had taught him to be cautious about Hope. The Mercy House was quiet when he arrived. Most of the residents were out during the day, some working temporary jobs, others looking for work, a few simply wandering the streets because sitting still in the shelter's day room was harder than walking. James found Tommy Rodriguez in the small television area, adjusting his prosthetic leg with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing it for years. "You're back early," Tommy observed. "How'd the morning go?" James sat down in the cracked vinyl chair next to his friend. Different than usual. He pulled out Richard Whitmore's business card and handed it to Tommy, who whistled softly when he read it. "Whitmore Industries? How'd you get this?" James told him about finding the wallet, about the visit to the glass tower, about Richard's unexpected job offer. Tommy listened without interrupting, his expression growing more incredulous with each detail. $50,000, Tommy said when James finished. Man, I don't know if I would have had your strength. Yes, you would have, James replied. It's who we are. It's who we were trained to be. Tommy looked at the business card and again. So what are you going to do? You going to call him? I don't know. Part of me thinks it's too good to be true. Maybe he's just caught up in the moment, grateful for getting his wallet back. By tomorrow, he might think better of it. Or maybe, Tommy said carefully, this is exactly what it seems like. A good man recognizing another good man and wanting to help. That evening, James lay on his narrow cot staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the shelter, settling down for the night. Snoring from the bed next to him, the distant hum of the heating system, someone having a nightmare in the far corner. These sounds had become the soundtrack of his life, so familiar he barely noticed them anymore. But tonight was different. Tonight, tucked in his shirt pocket, was a piece of paper that might represent a way out of this place. Not just the shelter, but the whole cycle of poverty and invisibility that had trapped him for 3 years. The question was whether he had the courage to make the phone call. 20 miles across town, Richard Whitmore sat in his study nursing a glass of whiskey and staring at a framed photograph on his mahogany desk. The photo showed a younger version of himself, with his arm around a beautiful woman with dark hair and laughing eyes. Next to them stood a teenage girl who had inherited her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn chin. The woman in the photo had been dead for 5 years now, taken by cancer that had moved through her body with ruthless efficiency despite the best medical care money could buy. The girl, his daughter Sarah, had been 23 then, old enough to make her own decisions about blame and forgiveness. She'd chosen blame. Richard picked up the photo, running his thumb along the silver frame. Elizabeth had been the moral compass of their family, the one who reminded him that success meant nothing if you lost your soul in the pursuit of it. She'd volunteered at homeless shelters, donated anonymously to veterans organizations, always pushing Richard to use his wealth and influence for more than just accumulating more wealth and influence. After she died, Sarah had expected him to continue her mother's charitable work, to honor her memory by becoming the kind of man Elizabeth had always believed he could be. Instead, Richard had buried himself in work, using business acquisitions and corporate expansion as a way to avoid dealing with his grief. When Sarah accused him of betraying everything her mother had stood for, he'd lashed out with the kind of corporate ruthlessness that had made him successful in business, but had destroyed his relationship with his only child. They hadn't spoken. In 2 years, Richard set the photo back down and took another sip of whiskey. Today, meeting James Mitchell, he'd felt something he hadn't experienced since Elizabeth's death: genuine respect for another human being. Not the kind of professional respect he had for successful business partners or competitors, but the deeper recognition of character that Elizabeth had always been able to see in people. James had reminded him of the men Elizabeth used to bring home from her volunteer work at the VA hospital, proud, dignified men who'd served their country and fallen through the cracks of an imperfect system. She'd always said that helping people wasn't about charity. It was about recognizing the fundamental dignity that every person possessed, regardless of their circumstances. Richard reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Sarah's number. His finger hovered over the call button for several minutes before he finally set the phone aside. Some conversations required more courage than he could muster at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, especially after half a glass of whiskey. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that made everything look like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. James woke at his usual time, went through his morning routine, and found himself standing outside the public library at 9 o'clock sharp. Richard Whitmore's business card damp with nervous sweat in his hand. The library's computer terminals, were located in a quiet corner of the main floor, surrounded by career development books and job search resources that James had memorized over the past 3 years. He'd used these computers to apply for hundreds of jobs, crafting careful cover letters that tried to explain away his homelessness without actually mentioning it, tailoring his military experience to civilian job requirements that never quite seemed to fit. But today was different. Today, he wasn't sending out another hopeful application into the void. Today, he was calling a man who had specifically asked him to call, who had looked him in the eye and offered him something real. Margaret answered on the second ring. "Mr. Whitmore's office. This is Margaret." "This is James Mitchell," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Mr. Whitmore asked me to call. Mr. Mitchell." "Good morning. Mr. Whitmore is in a meeting right now, but he left specific instructions that if you called, I should put you through immediately. Please hold just one moment." The whole music was something classical and expensive sounding. James found himself listening to the conversations around him, a young mother helping her toddler pick out picture books, 2 college students arguing about a research project, an elderly man reading the newspaper out loud to himself. Normal people living normal lives, the kind of life he'd once taken for granted. "James?" Richard's voice came through the phone with genuine warmth. "I was hoping you'd call. Have you thought about our conversation yesterday?" "I have," James replied. "Mr. Whitmore, I want to be completely honest with you. I'm interested in the position you mentioned, but I need you to understand what you'd be getting into. I haven't held a steady job in 3 years. I'm living in a homeless shelter. I don't have professional clothes or reliable transportation. If you're making this offer out of gratitude or pity..." "Stop right there," Richard interrupted, but his tone was gentle rather than sharp. "Let me ask you something. How did you feel when you saw that wallet yesterday morning?" The question caught James off guard. "I don't understand." "The moment you saw it, thick with cash, before you opened it and realized how much money was inside, what was your first thought?" James considered the question carefully. "I thought that whoever lost it was probably worried about it. I thought about how I'd feel if I lost something important." "Exactly," Richard said. "Your first instinct was empathy, not opportunity. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" "James, I've interviewed hundreds of people for positions at this company. I've hired MBAs from top universities, executives with decades of experience, consultants who charge $500 an hour. And yesterday, sitting in my office, you impressed me more than any of them ever have." James felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I appreciate that, sir, but nothing. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to come in this afternoon for a formal interview with our facilities director, a man named Frank Chun, who runs our security and maintenance operations. If he agrees that you're right for the position, and I suspect he will, we'll get you started immediately. We have corporate housing available for new employees. Nothing fancy, but clean and private. And we have an employee assistance program that can help with everything from professional clothing to transportation." Richard paused, and James could hear papers shuffling in the background. "I'm not offering you charity, James. I'm offering you a chance to work for what you get, to prove yourself on your own merits. The only advantage you have is that I already know your character. Everything else you'll have to earn." James closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 3 years of disappointment and false hope pressing down on him. What if I let you down? What if I'm not ready for this? What if you are? Richard asked quietly. What if this is exactly what both of us need right now? "James, I'm going to tell you something I haven't shared with anyone. My wife died 5 years ago, and trying to deal with that loss, I became someone she wouldn't have recognized. Someone focused only on profit and success. Someone who forgot that business is supposed to serve people, not the other way around." Richard's voice grew softer. "Yesterday, when you walked into my office and handed me that wallet, You reminded me of the man my wife always believed I could be. Maybe this isn't just about me helping you. Maybe it's about you helping me remember who I'm supposed to be." The line was quiet for a long moment. James could hear the sounds of the library around him, but they seemed distant and muffled. "Mr. Whitmore," he said finally, "if you're serious about this, then yes, I'd like to try." "I'm serious," Richard replied. "Can you be here at 2 o'clock this afternoon?" "I'll be there." "Good. And James, thank you for yesterday and for today, for reminding me that there are still people in the world who do the right thing simply because it's right." After hanging up, James sat in the library chair for several minutes, staring at the phone in his hands. Around him, life continued its normal rhythm, but for him, everything had changed. The future, which had seemed like an endless repetition of shelter nights and panhandling mornings, suddenly held possibility again. He spent the next hour in the library's restroom, doing his best to make himself presentable for the afternoon interview. His beard was neatly trimmed, his hair combed back with water, his military jacket brushed clean of lint and dust. Looking in the mirror, he saw a man who still carried himself with military bearing, despite 3 years of life on the streets. The walk back to Whitmore Industries felt different this time. Instead of a homeless man returning a lost wallet, he was a job candidate going to an interview. The distinction might have seemed small to an outside observer, but to James, it meant everything. Margaret greeted him like an old friend when he arrived at the 40th floor. "Mr. Mitchell, right on time. Mr. Chun is waiting for you in the conference room." Frank Chun turned out to be a man in his early 50s with calloused hands and an easy smile. Unlike Richard Whitmore's tailored suits and executive bearing, Chun wore practical clothes and had the air of someone who'd worked his way up from the ground floor. "So, you're the famous wallet returner," Chun said, shaking James's hand with a firm grip. "Richard told me what you did. Impressive." The interview lasted an hour and felt more like a conversation between colleagues than a formal job screening. Chun asked about James's military experience, his leadership background, his understanding of security protocols. When the subject of his homelessness came up, Chun addressed it directly but without judgment. "Richard told me about your situation," Chun said. "I want you to know that doesn't concern me professionally. What concerns me is whether you can do the job. Based on what I've heard about your military record and what I've seen in this conversation, I think you can." Chun leaned back in his chair. "The position would involve overseeing our night security staff, coordinating with building maintenance, managing vendor relationships for cleaning and repair services. It's not glamorous work, but it's important. This building houses 5,000 people during business hours. Keeping them safe and comfortable requires attention to detail and good judgment." "I understand," James said. "What would the expectations be?" "Show up, do the work, treat people with respect. In return, you'll get a competitive salary, full benefits, and the support you need to get back on your feet. We have temporary corporate housing, available small apartments we keep for relocated employees. Nothing fancy, but private and clean. You'd be eligible to use one while you get established." James felt his chest tighten with emotion. "Mr. Chun, I have to ask, is this really happening? 3 days ago, I was sleeping in a shelter, and now you're offering me a job and an apartment?" Chun smiled. "It's really happening. But James, I want to be clear about something. This opportunity exists because Richard Whitmore believes in your character, and because I think you have the skills to do the job well. But from this point forward, you succeed or fail based on your own performance. No special treatment, no exceptions because of your story. Fair enough?" "More than fair," James replied. "When would I start?" "How about Monday? That gives you the weekend to get settled in the apartment, pick up some work clothes, whatever else you need. Margaret has all the paperwork and keys ready for you." Walking out of Whitmore Industries an hour later, James carried a manila envelope containing an employment contract, apartment keys, and a company credit card for immediate expenses. In his pocket was a check for his first week's salary, advanced so he could buy clothes and necessities for his new life. The corporate apartment was in a modest building 10 minutes from downtown, furnished simply but completely. Standing in the small living room, James set down the single plastic bag that contained all his worldly possessions and looked around at his new home. A real home, with a door that locked from the inside, a private bathroom, a kitchen where he could cook his own meals. He sat down on his couch, and pulled out his phone to call Tommy Rodriguez. When his friend answered, James could hear the television in the shelter's day room in the background. "Tommy, it's James. You're not going to believe what just happened." As he told Tommy about the interview, the job, the apartment, James could hear the wonder in his own voice. 3 days ago, his biggest concern had been whether the morning crowd at the bus stop would be generous enough to buy him lunch. Now he was planning for a future that extended beyond the next meal, the next night shelter bed. "Man," Tommy said when James finished, "this is incredible. But what are you going to do about Sarah?" Sarah, James's daughter. The relationship that had been broken by his drinking, his anger, his inability to be the father she'd needed when she was 12 and scared and watching her hero self-destruct. For 3 years, getting his life together had been an abstract goal, something he worked toward without really believing it was possible. Now, with a job and an apartment and a chance to rebuild, the thought of reconnecting with his daughter shifted from impossible dream to terrifying possibility. "I don't know," James admitted. "I'm not even sure she'd want to hear from me." "Only one way to find out," Tommy replied. "But maybe get settled in your new life first. Show her you're not the same man who disappointed her before." That night, James slept in a real bed for the first time in 3 years. The apartment was quiet in a way the shelter never was. No snoring, no nightmares, no sound of 30 desperate men trying to find peace in sleep. He lay awake for a long time, not from insomnia, but from the simple pleasure of privacy and silence. Before drifting off, he thought about Richard Whitmore's words about character being what you do when no one's watching. For 3 years, James had maintained his integrity in circumstances that would have broken many people. Now he had the chance to see what that same character could build when given the opportunity to flourish. James's first week at Whitmore Industries passed in a blur of orientation sessions, security briefings, and getting to know the complex rhythms of a building that never truly slept. His official start time was 6 p.m., when the day shift headed home and the night crew took over. But he'd been arriving early each day to shadow Frank Chun and learn the intricacies of facilities management. The building housed everything from corporate law firms to investment banks to consulting companies, each with their own security requirements and operational needs. James quickly learned that his job was part diplomat, part problem solver, and part guardian. When the third-floor law firm worked late on a major case, he coordinated with security to ensure they had access and safety. When the VACA system in the East Wing started making concerning noises, he knew which maintenance contractor to call and how to escalate the issue appropriately. On Friday afternoon, as James was reviewing the weekend security schedule in Frank's office, he noticed a document on the desk that made him pause. It was a medical discharge letter from the VA, dated 15 years earlier, with Frank Chun's name at the top. Frank noticed James's attention and smiled ruefully. "Marine Corps, 1995 to 2010. Took some shrapnel in Fallujah that ended my career earlier than I planned." "I didn't know," James said. "You never mentioned." "Why would I?" Frank interrupted gently. "It's not the most important thing about me. Just like your current situation isn't the most important thing about you. But it's part of why Richard thought we'd work well together. Takes one to know one. if you know what I mean. That evening, as James made his rounds through the building's 40 floors, he reflected on Frank's words. In the military, your service record was everything. It defined your rank, your responsibilities, your place in the hierarchy. But in civilian life, he was learning. Military service was just one piece of a much larger puzzle that made up a person's identity. The weekend passed quietly. James spent Saturday shopping for work clothes and basic necessities, marveling at the simple luxury of being able to buy what he needed without calculating every dollar. Sunday, he cleaned his apartment thoroughly and called Tommy Rodriguez to check on things at the shelter. "You sound different," Tommy observed. "More like the sergeant I remember from when we first met." "I feel different," James admitted. "Like I'm remembering who I used to be before everything fell apart." Monday morning brought James his first real test as facilities manager. He arrived at the building at 5 a.m. to find the main lobby flooded with 2 inches of water from a burst pipe in the basement. The overnight security guard was in full panic mode, unsure whether to evacuate the building or try to contain the damage. James took one look at the situation and shifted into the kind of crisis management mode that had served him well in Afghanistan. Within 20 minutes, he called the emergency maintenance contractor, redirected building traffic through the side entrance, and deployed portable pumps to minimize water damage. By 7 a.m., when the first employees began arriving for work, the crisis was contained and repair work was underway. Frank Chun arrived to find James coordinating with contractors in the basement. His dress shirt rolled up to his elbows and his tie loosened, looking every inch the competent manager he'd once been in the Army. "Nice work," Frank said simply. "How do you know to call Pinnacle Emergency Services instead of our regular contractor?" 22 years of military logistics, James replied. "You learn to think 3 steps ahead and always have backup plans for your backup plans." That afternoon, Richard Whitmore stopped by the facilities office, something Frank mentioned he rarely did. He found James updating the building's emergency response procedures based on lessons learned from the morning's flood. "I heard about your handling of the water main break," Richard said. "Impressive response time." "Just doing the job," James replied. But he couldn't hide his satisfaction in having handled the crisis competently. Richard sat down across from James's desk, and James noticed something different about his demeanor. The polished executive confidence was still there, but underneath, it was something more vulnerable, more human. "James, can I ask you a personal question? You mentioned that you lost touch with your family when your life fell apart. Do you ever think about reaching out to them?" The question caught James off guard. "Every day," he admitted. "But what would I say? Sorry I disappeared for 3 years, but I'm doing better now? Some damage might be too extensive to repair." Richard was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the city below. "My daughter hasn't spoken to me in 2 years, he said finally. "We had a fight after her mother's funeral about the direction of my life, about whether I was honoring Elizabeth's memory or betraying it. She accused me of becoming someone her mother wouldn't recognize, and instead of listening, I got defensive and said things I can't take back." James studied Richard's profile, seeing the pain that the man usually kept hidden behind executive composure. "What kind of things?" "I told her that her mother's charitable work was naive, that real change happened through business success, not through hand-holding and feel-good gestures. I accused her of being an idealistic child who didn't understand how the real world worked." Richard's voice was barely above a whisper. "She looked at me like I was a stranger, told me I'd become exactly the kind of person her mother used to feel sorry for, and walked out. That was the last time we spoke. Have you tried to apologize? How do you apologize for becoming someone your own daughter can't respect? How do you prove that you've changed when you're not even sure you have?" James leaned back in his chair, thinking about his own daughter, Sarah, who'd been 12 when he'd started drinking heavily and taking his frustrations out on everyone around him. He thought about the fear in her eyes when he'd come home angry, the way she'd started spending more and more time at friends' houses to avoid being home when he was there. "Maybe," James said carefully, "the apology isn't about proving you've changed. Maybe it's about acknowledging the damage you did and taking responsibility for it, regardless of whether forgiveness is possible." Richard looked at him with interest. "You sound like you've given this some thought." 3 years of thinking and no action, James admitted. "It's easier to plan what you'd say than to actually pick up the phone." They sat in comfortable silence. For several minutes, two men who'd achieved success in their respective fields but had failed at the most important job of all being good fathers to their daughters. "What was your daughter's name?" Richard asked. "Sarah. She's 25 now, lives in Portland, works as a social worker." "I know because I've looked her up online more times than I can count, but I've never had the courage to actually contact her." "My daughter is also named Sarah," Richard said with surprise. "Sarah Elizabeth, after her mother. She's 28, lives here in the city, runs a nonprofit that helps homeless veterans get housing and job training." James felt a chill run down his spine. "What's the name of the nonprofit?" "Harbor House. It's downtown, near the—" Richard stopped, his eyes widening as he made the connection. "James, when you were homeless, did you ever hear of Harbor House?" "I tried to get help there about 6 months ago," James said slowly. "The waiting list was too long, but the woman who interviewed me was incredibly kind, professional, but genuinely caring. I remember thinking she reminded me of my daughter, if Sarah had grown up to be the kind of person I'd always hoped she'd become." Richard stared at him. What did this woman look like? About 5'6", dark hair like her mother's, but with these intense blue eyes that seemed to see right through you. She had this way of talking that made you feel like your story mattered, like you weren't just another case file. "That's my Sarah," Richard whispered. "My daughter." The two men looked at each other across James's desk. The weight of coincidence, or perhaps something more than coincidence, settling between them? Richard's daughter had been helping homeless veterans while Richard himself had been walking past them on the street without a second thought. James's own daughter had found her, calling in social work, while James had been too proud to accept the help that people like her offered. "This is going to sound crazy," Richard said, "but what if we helped each other? What if we both found the courage to reach out to our daughters?" James felt his heart rate increase. "I don't know if I'm ready. I don't think either of us will ever feel ready," Richard interrupted. "But maybe ready isn't the point. Maybe the point is that we both know we made mistakes, and we both know our daughters deserve better than we gave them." James thought about the last conversation he'd had with his Sarah the day before he'd lost his apartment. She'd called to check on him, and instead of admitting how bad things had gotten, he'd lied and told her everything was fine. When she'd offered to help, he'd snapped at her, told her he didn't need charity from his own daughter. The call had ended with both of them angry, and James had been too ashamed to call back. "What would you suggest?" James asked. Richard pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found his daughter's number. "I suggest we both stop being cowards and make the calls we should have made years ago." James reached for his own phone, his hands shaking slightly as he found Sarah's contact information. He'd never deleted it, even during the darkest days when calling her seemed impossible. "Together?" Richard asked. "Together," James agreed. They each took a deep breath and dialed their daughters' numbers. Two fathers preparing to face the consequences of their failures and hoping, perhaps for the first time in years, that love might be stronger than the mistakes that had driven their families apart. The phone rang 3 times before Sarah Mitchell's voice answered, professional and cautious. "This is Sarah." James closed his eyes, hearing his daughter's voice for the first time in 3 years. She sounded older, more confident than the young woman he remembered, but there was something familiar in her tone that took him back to bedtime. Stories and scraped knees and the days when he'd been her hero instead of her disappointment. "Sarah, it's your father." The silence that followed stretched for so long that James wondered if the call had been dropped. Across the desk, he could hear Richard having his own difficult conversation in low, careful tones. "Dad?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "Is this really you?" "It's really me," James said, his throat tight with emotion. "I know I have no right to call you after all this time, but I needed to hear your voice. I needed you to know that I'm sorry." "Where? Are you? Are you safe?" "I've been—" Sarah stopped herself, and James could hear her taking a steadying breath. "I tried to find you about a year ago. I called shelters, checked hospital records, contacted the VA. Nobody had any information." The knowledge that his daughter had been looking for him, worrying about him, hit James like a physical blow. "I'm safe," he said. "I'm in the city, and I have a job now and a place to live." "Sarah, I know I hurt you terribly the last time we spoke. I know I was angry and proud, and I pushed you away when you were trying to help. You told me you didn't need charity from your own daughter," Sarah said quietly. "You told me to stop treating you like one of my clients." "I was wrong," James said simply. "I was scared and ashamed, and I took that out on you instead of accepting that my little girl had grown up to be someone who helps people for a living. Someone who was trying to help her own father because she loved him, despite everything he'd done to disappoint her." James could hear Sarah crying softly on the other end of the line. "I thought you might be dead," she whispered. "I thought I'd never get the chance to tell you that I forgave you, that I understood why you were so angry after you came home from deployment." "You have nothing to forgive me for," James said. "I was the adult. I was supposed to take care of you, not the other way around. I was supposed to get help from my problems instead of letting them destroy our family." Across the desk, Richard was speaking quietly into his own phone, and James could see tears in the older man's eyes. Whatever conversation he was having with his daughter seemed to be going better than either of them had dared hope. "Dad," Sarah said, "I need you to know something. The work I do now, helping veterans get back on their feet, I do it because of you. Because I saw what happened to someone. I loved when the system failed him. Every person I help, every family I reunite, I do it hoping that somewhere out there, someone is helping my father too." James felt his chest tighten with pride and sorrow. His daughter had taken her pain and turned it into purpose, had channeled her love for him into love for strangers who needed what she couldn't give her own father. "I'm proud of you," he said. "I've looked you up online, read about the work you do at Harbor House. You became exactly the kind of person your mother always knew you'd be." "Harbor House?" Sarah's voice sharpened with surprise. "Dad, that's where I work. That's my nonprofit." "I know. I tried to get help there about 6 months ago, but the waiting list was too long. I met with a social worker there, a young woman with dark hair and blue eyes who made me feel like my story mattered. I thought about you the whole time, wondered if you'd grown up to be someone like her." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Dad, what was the social worker's name?" "I don't remember exactly. Sarah something, I think." "Why? Dad, I think I interviewed you." "I remember an older veteran, very dignified despite his circumstances, who reminded me of someone, but I couldn't place who. You gave a fake name, didn't you?" James felt the world shifting around him. "John Mitchell. I was too ashamed to use my real name in case word got back to you somehow." "Oh my God," Sarah breathed. "I knew there was something familiar about you. I kept thinking about that interview for weeks afterward, wishing I could have done more to help." "Dad, if I had known it was you, you would have helped me because I was your father instead of helping me because I needed help," James finished. "And I would have accepted that help out of guilt instead of gratitude. Maybe it happened the way it was supposed to happen. They talked for another 20 minutes, carefully sharing pieces of their lives from the past 3 years. Sarah told him about her work, about the apartment she shared with 2 rescue cats, about the man she'd been dating who was a teacher at an inner-city school. James told her about his time on the streets, about the shelter, about finding Richard's wallet and how that simple act of honesty had changed everything. When they finally hung up, with plans to meet for dinner the next evening, James felt like he could breathe fully for the first time in years. Across the desk, Richard was ending his own call, wiping his eyes with his handkerchief. "How did it go?" James asked. "Better than I deserved," Richard replied. "She's agreed to have lunch with me tomorrow. Neutral ground, a little cafe near her office where she feels comfortable." She was cautious, but not hostile. "I think she's willing to listen." "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That I've spent 2 years becoming someone I don't recognize. In that meeting, you reminded me of the man her mother fell in love with. That I wanted to try to honor Elizabeth's memory instead of betraying it, but I don't know how to do that alone." Richard looked at the framed photograph on James's desk, a picture of James and Sarah from her high school graduation, both of them smiling and proud. "It's funny," Richard said. "We're both successful men in our own ways, but the most important, relationships in our lives fell apart because we forgot how to be human." "Maybe it's not too late to remember," James suggested. Over the next few days, both men threw themselves into the delicate work of rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by years of pride, pain, and misunderstanding. James met Sarah for dinner at a quiet restaurant downtown, where they talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing, slowly rediscovering the bond that had once made them inseparable. Sarah told him about her work with Harbor House, about the veterans she'd helped find housing and employment, about the families she'd reunited. She also told him about the ones she hadn't been able to save, the men and women who'd been too proud or too broken to accept help, who disappeared back into the streets before she could make a difference. "I think about them all the time," Sarah said over dessert. "I wonder where they are, whether they're safe, whether they found their way to something better, or whether they're still out there struggling." "They know you tried," James said. "That matters more than you might think. Even when we don't accept help, knowing that someone cares enough to offer it makes a difference." Richard's lunch with his daughter started more tentatively. Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore had inherited her mother's compassion, but also her father's stubborn streak, and she wasn't inclined to make reconciliation easy for him. She listened to his apologies with the careful attention of someone who'd been disappointed before, weighing his words against his actions. "You can't just say you're sorry and expect everything to go back to the way it was," she told him over coffee. "You spent 2 years becoming someone Mom wouldn't recognize. How do I know this isn't just another business strategy, another way to get what you want?" "You don't," Richard admitted. "All I can do is show you day by day that I'm serious about changing. And Sarah, I need you to know that this isn't about getting what I want. This is about becoming who I should have been all along." He told her about James, about the wallet, about the reminder of what integrity looked like when it cost you something. He told her about his conversation with James about fatherhood and failure, about the realization that he'd become exactly the kind of person Elizabeth used to worry about, successful but soulless. "There's something else," Richard said carefully. "The man I told you about, the one who returned my wallet, I think he might have crossed paths with your nonprofit. His name is James Mitchell, and he has a daughter named Sarah who works in Veteran Services." Sarah Elizabeth's eyes widened. "Wait, are you talking about the James Mitchell who just started working in your building? The facilities manager? You know him?" "I know his daughter. We've been corresponding for months about coordinating services for veterans in the downtown area. She runs a program in Portland that's similar to what we do here. I've been trying to convince her to come visit Harbor House to see if there might be opportunities for collaboration." Richard stared at his daughter. "This is getting surreal." James and I were just talking about how both our daughters work in veteran services. And now you're telling me you already know his daughter? Not personally, but professionally. And Dad, if James Mitchell is half the man his daughter is, then you hired someone special. Sarah Mitchell has helped more veterans get back on their feet than anyone I know. Her programs have been models for nonprofits across the country. That evening, Richard called James with the news of this latest connection, and they marveled at the web of coincidences that seemed to be drawing their families together. Two estranged fathers, two daughters in similar fields, two women named Sarah, who'd both dedicated their lives to helping people like James. Maybe it's not coincidence, James suggested. Maybe it's just the world being smaller than we think. Or maybe, Richard replied, it's a reminder that the things we have in common are more important than the things that divide us. As the week progressed, both men found themselves cautiously optimistic about the possibility of rebuilding their relationships with their daughters. The conversations were still careful, still laden with years of hurt and disappointment, but they were happening. For the first time in years, both James and Richard had reason to hope that their failures as fathers didn't have to define the rest of their relationships with their children. The real test would come when words had to be backed up by actions, when good intentions had to be sustained over time. But for now, it was enough that the conversations had started, that the silence had been broken. The two daughters were willing to consider the possibility that their fathers might be capable of change. James kept the letter he'd written to Sarah, but never sent tucked in his desk drawer at work, a handwritten apology that had taken him hours to compose during his darkest days at the shelter. Now, with his daughter back in his life, the letter served as a reminder of how far he'd come and how close he'd come to losing everything that mattered. Sometimes, the greatest courage wasn't found in facing enemy fire or making life or death decisions. Sometimes, it was found in picking up the phone and admitting you'd been wrong, in swallowing your pride and asking for forgiveness you weren't sure you deserved. Both James and Richard were learning that lesson, one difficult conversation at a time. 3 weeks into his new job, James had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and revolutionary. The work itself reminded him of his military days, coordinating multiple moving parts, solving problems before they became crises, managing people and resources with precision and care. But unlike his Army service, this job came with the luxury of going home to his own apartment each night, of having weekends free to rebuild his relationship with Sarah. He was reviewing the quarterly security assessment when Frank Chun knocked on his office door, holding a manila folder that looked suspiciously like the personnel files James had been learning to navigate. "Got a minute?" Frank asked, settling into the chair across from James's desk. "I wanted to talk to you about something." James set aside his paperwork. Over the past few weeks, he and Frank had developed an easy working relationship built on mutual respect and their shared understanding of military culture. Frank was the first supervisor James had worked under since leaving the Army, who seemed to understand that leadership experience was transferable, regardless of the uniform you'd worn. "Richard's been singing your praises to anyone who'll listen," Frank said. "The board meeting yesterday, he spent 10 minutes talking about how you handled the flood situation and the improvements you've made to our emergency protocols." "I'm just doing the job," James replied, though he couldn't hide his satisfaction at the feedback. "That's what makes you good at it," Frank said. "But here's the thing. Richard's been talking about expanding our facilities management program. He wants to offer consulting services to other commercial property owners, help them improve their security and emergency response capabilities." Frank opened the folder and pulled out what looked like a business proposal. "He's asked me to develop a plan for a new division, and I'm going to need someone to help me run it. Someone with your kind of experience and judgment." James felt his pulse quicken. "What are you talking about? A promotion?" "Assistant Director of Facilities Management," with a focus on developing and implementing our consulting services. It would mean more responsibility, better pay, and the chance to help build something from the ground up. James stared at the proposal document, seeing his name listed as the proposed assistant director. A month ago, he'd been sleeping in a shelter, and now he was being offered a promotion that would put him in a position of real authority and responsibility. "Frank, I've been here 3 weeks," James said carefully. "Don't you think this is moving a little fast?" "In most situations, yes," Frank replied. "But you're not most people. Your performance these past weeks has been exceptional, and more importantly, you've already proven your character in ways that matter more than any job interview could reveal." Frank leaned forward. "James, I've been in management for 15 years, and I've learned to recognize people who have what it takes to lead. You've got it. The question is whether you're ready to believe in yourself the way the rest of us already do." That evening, James called Sarah to tell her about the promotion offer. She was at her office, working late on a grant application that would fund housing for 50 more veterans, and her voice was tired but pleased when she answered. "Dad, that's wonderful. But are you sure you're ready for that kind of responsibility?" It was a fair question. 3 weeks ago, his biggest decision had been which corner to panhandle on. Now he was being asked to help develop and lead a new business division. "I don't know," James admitted. "Part of me thinks I should be grateful for what I have and not push for more. But another part of me remembers who I used to be, remembers what it felt like to be good at something important." "What does your gut tell you?" James considered the question. His gut told him he was ready, that the skills and experience that had made him a good sergeant could make him a good business leader. But his gut also carried 3 years of self-doubt and the fear that this new life was too good to be true. "My gut says I can do the job," he said finally. "But my brain keeps waiting for the other shoe to drop." "Dad, do you remember what you used to tell me when I was afraid to try something new?" James smiled, remembering the conversations they'd had when Sarah was in high school, agonizing over whether to run for student council or try out for the debate team. "I told you that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was feeling the fear and doing the right thing anyway." "Exactly. So, what's the right thing here?" James knew the answer even before Sarah asked the question. The right thing was to trust in his abilities, to believe that Richard and Frank saw something in him worth developing, and to take on the responsibility he was being offered. Meanwhile, across town, Richard was having his own conversation with his daughter over dinner at a small Italian restaurant that had been Elizabeth's favorite. Sarah Elizabeth had agreed to weekly dinners as part of their reconciliation process, and these carefully structured meals were slowly rebuilding the foundation of their relationship. "I want to show you something," Richard said, pulling out his father's watch and setting it on the table between them. It was a beautiful piece gold with a leather band, engraved with his grandfather's initials. Richard had worn it every day for 20 years, but he'd never really thought about what it represented. "Dad's old watch?" Sarah said, confused. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I realized I've been wearing it like a costume," Richard said. "It's a family heirloom, passed down from my grandfather to my father to me, and I've always assumed I understood what it meant. Success, legacy, the continuation of family tradition." Richard picked up the watch and turned it over, reading the inscription on the back that he'd memorized, but never truly considered. "For Richard Sr., with love and gratitude for 30 years of service to our community. The Harbor District. Community Center, 1952. Sarah's eyes widened as she read the inscription. Grandpa worked at a community center? "He founded it," Richard said quietly. "After he came back from World War II, he used his GI benefits to buy a building in what was then the poorest part of the city. He spent 30 years running programs for veterans, job training for unemployed men, food services for families who couldn't afford groceries." Richard fastened the watch back on his wrist. but now it felt different, heavier with meaning rather than tradition. I grew up thinking he was successful because he built a business empire. But I was wrong. He was successful because he spent his life helping people who needed help. The business empire came later, and it was never the point. Sarah studied her father's face, seeing something there she hadn't seen since before her mother's death, genuine humility mixed with purpose. Why are you telling me this now? Because meeting James reminded me of who my father really was, and who your mother always hoped I could become. James returned that wallet not because it was profitable or strategic, but because it was right. That's the same impulse that drove my father to spend 30 years serving his community. Richard leaned back in his chair, looking around the restaurant where he and Elizabeth had shared so many dinners during their marriage. I've been thinking about expanding the company's community outreach programs, not as a tax write-off or a public relations move, but as a genuine effort to honor your mother's memory and my father's example. What kind of programs? Sarah asked, her professional interest clearly engaged. I was hoping you might help me figure that out. You'll work with Harbor House, their understanding of what veterans and homeless families actually need. I want to learn from that. I want to find ways for Whitmore Industries to make a real difference, not just write checks to feel good about ourselves. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, processing this unexpected turn in their conversation. For 2 years, she'd seen her father as someone who'd abandoned the values her mother had tried to instill in him. Now he was asking her to help him find his way back to those values. There's something I should tell you, Sarah said finally. I've been thinking about leaving Harbor House. Richard felt his heart sink. Why? I thought you loved the work. I do love the work, but the organization has grown to the point where I spend more time on administrative tasks than actually helping people. I've been thinking about starting something smaller, more focused. Maybe a program that specifically helps veterans transition from homelessness to stable employment. That sounds exactly like something your mother would have supported, Richard said. And exactly like something Whitmore Industries could help fund. Sarah looked at him skeptically. Dad, I don't want your money if it comes with strings attached. I don't want to be your pet charity project. Not my pet project, Richard said. My partner. I'm talking about a genuine collaboration, your expertise in veteran services, my resources and business experience working together to create something that could really make a difference. The idea was appealing, Sarah had to admit. She'd been frustrated by the limitations of working within an established nonprofit, by the bureaucracy that slowed down help for people who needed it immediately. The possibility of building something new, something more responsive and effective, was exactly the kind of challenge she'd been looking for. I want full autonomy over the program design and implementation, she said carefully, of course, and I'd want it to be financially independent of Whitmore Industries within 3 years. I don't want to build something that would collapse if you changed your mind about supporting it. That makes perfect sense, Richard agreed. What else? Sarah smiled for the first time since their reconciliation had begun. Not the careful, guarded smile she'd been offering, but a genuine expression of excitement and possibility. I'd want to hire James Mitchell's daughter as our director of program development. Her work in Portland has been groundbreaking, and I think she'd be perfect for what we're trying to build. Richard felt a strange sense of completion, as if pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving were finally clicking into place. You know, a month ago, if someone had told me that returning a lost wallet would lead to me working with my daughter to help homeless veterans, I would have thought they were crazy. Maybe that's how the best things happen, Sarah said. When you stop planning and start doing what's right, the universe finds ways to support you. The next morning, James accepted the promotion offer, and Richard called an all-hands meeting to announce the expansion of Whitmore Industries' Facilities Management Division. But more importantly, father and daughter Mitchell had dinner together for the 3rd time in a month, and father and daughter Whitmore began planning a nonprofit venture that would combine their respective strengths in service of something larger than either of them could accomplish alone. Frank Chun found James in his office that afternoon, updating organizational charts and trying to wrap his mind around his new responsibilities. "Feeling overwhelmed?" Frank asked. "Terrified and exhilarated," James admitted. "It's been a long time since I had something to lose." "That's what makes you the right person for this job," Frank said. "People who have something to lose tend to work harder to make sure they don't lose it." Frank settled into his chair with the comfortable air of someone delivering good news. "I've got the final budget approval for the consulting division, and I've got authorization to hire 2 additional staff members. You ready to start building a team?" James looked at the organizational chart on his computer screen, seeing his name at the top of a division that didn't exist a month ago, responsible for services that could help other companies better serve their communities. It was more responsibility than he'd held since leaving the military, and more opportunity than he'd dared hope for during his years on the streets. "I'm ready," he said, and for the first time in years, he meant it completely. That evening, Richard sat in his study holding his father's watch and thinking about the inscription he'd carried without understanding for 20 years. 30 years of service to the community, not 30 years of building wealth or accumulating power, but 30 years of helping people who needed help. He thought about James, about the quiet dignity with which the man had returned a wallet. That could have changed his life. He thought about his daughter, dedicating her career to helping veterans like James find their way back to stability and purpose. And he thought about Elizabeth, who would have seen the connections between all these people and events long before he did. Maybe it was never too late to become the person you were supposed to be. Maybe the values that mattered most weren't the ones that showed up on quarterly reports or annual performance reviews. Maybe success was measured not by what you accumulated, but by what you gave away and how many lives you touched in the process. Richard wound his father's watch, listening to the steady tick that had been marking time for more than 70 years, and made a promise to the memory of 2 people he'd loved and lost, his father and his wife, that he would spend whatever time he had left trying to honor the legacy they'd left him, whether he'd understood it or not. 2 months into his new role as assistant director, James had settled into a routine that balanced the demands of building a new business division with the quieter work of rebuilding his relationship with Sarah. Their weekly dinners had become a cornerstone of his life, a reminder that some bonds could survive even the worst mistakes, if both people were willing to do the hard work of forgiveness. It was during one of these dinners that Sarah mentioned she'd been researching her father's military service for a grant application that required detailed veteran information. She'd been working with a historian at the National Archives to compile comprehensive records for the nonprofit she and Richard were developing. "Dad, I found something interesting about your service record," she said over dessert at their favorite diner. "Something I don't think you ever told me about." James felt a familiar tightness in his chest. There were parts of his military service he'd never discussed with anyone, classified operations that had shaped him in ways he'd never fully processed. What kind of something? Sarah pulled out a folder from her purse and opened it to reveal a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local Sergeant Saves Afghan Village from Insurgent Attack," and below it was a photograph of a younger James in full combat gear, standing next to a group of Afghan children outside a small schoolhouse. The article says you led a mission that prevented a terrorist attack on a school, Sarah continued. It says you saved the lives of over 200 children and their teachers. James stared at the newspaper clipping, memories flooding back with painful clarity. Operation Eagle Shield, his final mission before the injury that ended his career. He'd never talked about it, not to Sarah, not to his ex-wife, not even to the VA counselors who tried to help him process his PTSD. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly. The historian found it in the archives of the Stars and Stripes. Dad, why didn't you ever tell me about this? You saved all those children. James was quiet for a long time, staring at the photograph of himself with the Afghan children. He remembered their faces, their laughter as they played in the schoolyard, despite the danger that surrounded them every day. He remembered the intelligence that had come in about the planned attack, the desperate race to evacuate the school before the insurgents arrived. Because 3 days later, those same insurgents attacked a different school in a village 20 miles away, he said finally. A school we hadn't been able to warn in time. 47 children died, along with 8 teachers. I saved 200 lives, but I couldn't save those 47. Sarah reached across the table and took her father's hand. Dad, you can't blame yourself for the people you couldn't save. You did everything possible to save the ones you could. Can I? James asked. For 22 years, I carried the weight of every mission, every decision, every life that hung in the balance. That's what leaders do. We take responsibility for our people, even when the outcome is beyond our control. But when you come home and you can't turn that responsibility off, when you can't stop carrying the weight of every failure alongside every success, it breaks something inside you. James pulled his hand away and folded the newspaper clipping carefully. The night I lost my temper with you, the night that started the fight that ended my marriage. I'd been having nightmares about those 47 children for weeks. I was angry at myself, at the army, at a world that could let such things happen, and I took that anger out on the people I loved most. Is that why you started drinking? I started drinking because it was the only way to make the nightmares stop, James admitted. But it didn't really stop them, it just postponed them. And in the meantime, it turned me into someone neither of us recognized. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, processing this new understanding of her father's struggles. She'd always known his military service had affected him, but she'd never understood the specific weight he'd been carrying. Dad, have you ever shown this article to Richard? James shook his head. Why would I? It's ancient history. Because I think he needs to see it. I think he needs to understand who you really are, what you've been through, what you've accomplished. That weekend, Richard was in his office reviewing quarterly reports when James knocked on his door. It was unusual for James to come in on Saturday, and Richard could see something serious in his expression. Do you have a few minutes? James asked. There's something I need to share with you. Richard gestured to the chair across from his desk. The same chair where James had sat 2 months earlier to return a wallet and change both their lives. James placed the newspaper clipping on the desk and waited while Richard read it. Richard's expression shifted as he took in the headline. The photograph, the details of the mission that had made James a hero in the eyes of his country. When he finished reading, he looked up at James with something approaching awe. James, this is extraordinary. You saved hundreds of lives. Why haven't you ever mentioned this? Because heroism is complicated, James replied. That mission taught me that you can do everything right and still fail the people who are counting on you. It taught me that the weight of command never really goes away, even after you take off the uniform. Richard studied the photograph more carefully, seeing something in the younger James's eyes that he recognized from their conversations about failure and responsibility. Is this why you ended up on the streets? The weight of carrying all this? Partly. When you spend 22 years in situations where your decisions mean life or death for other people, it's hard to adjust to civilian life where the stakes seem so much smaller. When you've seen what human beings are capable of doing to each other, it's hard to care about mortgage payments and performance reviews. James leaned back in his chair. I got treatment for PTSD, eventually, but the damage to my family was already done. My wife couldn't understand why I'd become angry and distant. My daughter was afraid of me. I was afraid of myself. Richard was quiet for several minutes, absorbing this new understanding of the man he'd come to consider a friend. James, why? Are you showing me this now? Because Sarah thinks you should know who I really am, not just who I've become since you gave me this job. She thinks understanding my military service might help you understand why trust and integrity matter so much to me. Richard looked at the newspaper clipping again, then at the man sitting across from his desk who'd returned $50,000 without hesitation. You know what this tells me? It tells me that you've been carrying the weight of other people's welfare your entire adult life. In the military, you carried it for your soldiers and the civilians you protected. On the streets, you carried it by maintaining your integrity, even when it cost you everything. And now, you're carrying it by helping me become a better man and rebuild my relationship with my daughter. Richard stood up and walked to his window, looking down at the city below. James, there's something I need to tell you. Something I haven't shared with anyone except Sarah. He turned back to face James, his expression serious. 5 years ago, when Elizabeth was dying, she made me promise that I'd use my wealth and influence to help people who couldn't help themselves. She said she wanted her death to mean something, to inspire me to become the kind of man she'd always believed I could be. Richard's voice grew quieter. Instead, I became obsessed with business. Success, with accumulating more wealth and power as a way to avoid dealing with my grief. I broke my promise to her, and in doing so, I lost my daughter's respect and my own sense of purpose. And now? James asked. Now I'm trying to figure out how to honor that promise, how to use what I have to make a real difference. The consulting, division, the nonprofit work with Sarah, the employee assistance programs, they're all part of trying to become who Elizabeth always believed I could be. Richard returned to his desk and picked up the newspaper clipping. This article doesn't just tell me about your military service, James. It tells me that you've been the kind of man Elizabeth would have admired, the kind of man my father was when he founded that community center. You've spent your life serving others, even when that service cost you everything. The two men sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, each reflecting on the weight of responsibility they'd carried, and the different ways they'd tried to honor the people they'd loved and lost. Richard, James said finally, can I ask you something? When you look at that photograph of me with those Afghan children, what do you see? Richard studied the photograph carefully. I see a man who understood that leadership means putting other people's welfare before your own. I see someone who knew that doing the right thing was more important than personal safety or comfort. That's exactly what I saw when you offered me this job, James replied. I saw a man who was willing to take a risk on someone who had nothing to offer except character. I saw someone who understood that integrity matters more than credentials or social status. Richard felt a warmth spreading through his chest, a recognition of kinship that went deeper than their business relationship, or even their growing friendship. Maybe that's what this has all been about, he said. Two men who lost their way, trying to find it again, and discovering that sometimes the best compass is the example of someone else who's committed to doing the right thing. James folded the newspaper clipping and put it back in his pocket. Sarah wants me to frame it and put it on my office wall. She says it's important for people to know who they're working with. She's right, Richard said. But more than that, it's important for you to remember who you are, regardless of what circumstances you find yourself in. You were a hero in Afghanistan. You were a man of integrity on the streets, and you're a leader worth following in this office. The circumstances changed, but the man didn't. As James left Richard's office that afternoon, both men carried with them a deeper understanding of the experiences that had shaped each other. The newspaper clipping had revealed more than a heroic military action. It had revealed the consistent character that had defined James Mitchell's life, even during its darkest chapters. For Richard, it was a reminder that true leadership wasn't about accumulating power or wealth, but about using whatever influence you had to protect and serve others. For James, it was a recognition that his military service His time on the streets and his current success were all part of the same story, a very story about a man who'd never stopped believing that doing the right thing was worth whatever it cost. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in late October, jarring James from the first peaceful sleep he'd enjoyed in months. His phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand, displaying Richard's number with the kind of urgency that could only mean one thing: crisis. "James, I need you to get to the office immediately." Richard's voice was tight with controlled panic. "We have a situation." James was pulling on his clothes before Richard finished explaining. A water main had burst in the building's sub-basement, flooding the electrical systems and threatening to shut down power to the entire 40-story complex. Worse, the building's emergency generators had failed to activate properly, leaving critical systems, elevators, fire safety, security, running on backup battery power that would last less than 4 hours. "The city's emergency services are overwhelmed with the storm-damaged citywide," Richard continued as James drove through the empty streets. "We're on our own until at least morning, maybe longer. Frank's already there coordinating with the maintenance crew, but we need someone who can think strategically about how to keep 5,000 people safe when they arrive for work in 4 hours." James arrived at Whitmore Industries to find organized chaos. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows through the lobby, while maintenance crews worked frantically in the flooded basement. Frank Chun met him at the security desk, his face grim with worry. "Here's what we know," Frank said without preamble. "The flooding has damaged our primary electrical systems, and the backup generators have a mechanical failure that our maintenance team can't fix until we get replacement parts. We've got maybe 3 hours of battery power left for essential systems." James studied the building schematics that Frank had spread across the security desk. 22 years of military logistics. Training kicked in automatically as he assessed the situation. Multiple problems, limited resources, people's safety at stake. Exactly the kind of crisis he'd been trained to handle. "What about evacuation?" James asked. "That's the problem," Frank replied. "With the elevators down and only battery-powered. Emergency lighting in the stairwells, evacuating 5,000 people would be dangerous, especially with the storm still raging outside. But if we can't restore power, we'll have no choice." James felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders. The same feeling he'd experienced in Afghanistan when lives hung in the balance and every decision mattered. "Show me the generator room." The next 3 hours tested every leadership skill James had developed over his military career. Working with Frank and the maintenance crew, he coordinated a complex operation that involved rerouting power from undamaged systems, jury-rigging temporary electrical connections, and implementing emergency protocols that would allow the building to function safely on minimal power. The breakthrough came when James remembered a similar situation from his time in Afghanistan, when his unit had been forced to restore power to a forward operating base using damaged equipment and improvised solutions. The principle was the same. You didn't need perfect systems, just functional ones that could keep people safe until proper repairs could be made. "We can't restore full power," James explained to Richard and Frank as dawn broke over the city. "But we can create a limited electrical grid that will keep essential systems running. Elevators on every 5th floor, emergency lighting throughout the building, and full power to critical areas like medical facilities and computer servers." By 7 a.m., when the first employees began arriving for work, James had orchestrated a plan that allowed the building to operate safely at reduced capacity. Signs at every entrance explained the situation and directed people to functioning elevators and properly lit stairwells. Emergency communication systems kept everyone informed of the building's status and safety procedures. Richard found James in the basement at 9 a.m., coordinating with the electrical contractors who'd finally arrived to begin permanent repairs. James was covered in soot and grease, his dress shirt ruined, and his tie long since discarded, but his eyes held the focused intensity of someone who'd spent the night solving problems that mattered. "Status report?" Richard asked. "Building secure," James replied. "We've got about 60% of normal electrical capacity, but all safety systems are functional. The contractors estimate full power restoration by this afternoon." Richard looked around the basement, taking in the complex network of temporary cables and jury-rig connections that James had supervised. "How did you know how to do all this?" "Forward Operating Base Kandahar, 2008, James said simply. "Taliban rockets took out our main power grid, and we had to keep a medical facility running while under siege. You learn to make things work with whatever you have." As they climbed back to the main floor, Richard felt a profound sense of gratitude mixed with recognition. The man walking beside him had spent the night protecting 5,000 people using skills and experience that couldn't be taught in business school or learned from management textbooks. "James, I need you to know something," Richard said as they entered the elevator. "What you did tonight, keeping this building safe, protecting all these people, it's exactly the kind of leadership this company needs. Not just during emergencies, but every day." That afternoon, as normal operations resumed throughout the building, Richard called an emergency meeting of the board of directors. The morning's crisis had crystallized something in his mind, a recognition of what real leadership looked like when it mattered most. "I'm recommending James Mitchell for promotion to Director of Operations," Richard announced to the board. This morning's crisis demonstrated that he has the experience, judgment, and character to handle the highest levels of responsibility in this organization. Board member Patricia Harrison, a woman Richard had known for 15 years, raised an eyebrow. "Richard, isn't this the homeless veteran you hired a few months ago? Are you sure you're not letting personal sentiment cloud your business judgment?" Richard felt his temper flare, but he forced himself to respond calmly. "Patricia, this morning, James Mitchell kept this building operational and 5,000 people safe using nothing but his experience, intelligence, and leadership ability. If you can show me an MBA from Harvard who could have done better under those circumstances, I'll withdraw my recommendation." The room was quiet for several minutes as the board members considered Richard's words. Finally, board chairman William Morrison spoke up. "Richard, we trust your judgment of personnel decisions. If you believe Mr. Mitchell is ready for this level of responsibility, we'll support your recommendation." The promotion made James the youngest director in Whitmore industry's history and put him in charge of operations for the entire company. More importantly, it represented a level of trust and responsibility that validated everything he'd worked to rebuild since returning Richard's wallet 6 months earlier. That evening, James called Sarah to share the news. She was at her office, working late on the nonprofit venture she and Richard had been developing, and her voice was warm with pride when she heard about his promotion. "Dad, I'm so proud of you," she said. "But I have to ask, are you ready for this? Director of Operations is a huge responsibility." "I think I am," James replied. "For the first time in years, I feel like I know who I am and what I'm capable of. This morning, when the crisis hit, I didn't panic or doubt myself. I just did what needed to be done." "That's the father I remember," Sarah said softly. "The man who always seemed to know what to do when things got difficult." James was quiet for a moment, thinking about the scared, angry man he'd been when his life fell apart, and the confident leader he felt like again today. "You know what the difference is? I'm not carrying this responsibility alone anymore. I have people who believe in me, people who trust me to do the right thing. That makes all the difference." Later that night, Richard sat in his study looking at the framed photograph of his wife that had occupied his desk for 5 years. The events of the past 24 hours had confirmed something he'd begun to suspect, that bringing James Mitchell into his company had changed not Just James's. Life, but his own.
"You would have liked him," Richard said to the photograph.
"He's exactly the kind of man you always said this world needed more of. Someone who puts other people's welfare before his own. Someone who does the right thing even when it costs him everything." Richard picked up his father's watch and wound it carefully, listening to the steady tick that had been marking time for more than 70 years. For the first time since Elizabeth's death, he felt like he was living up to the legacy that watch represented, the legacy of men who used their strength and resources to protect and serve others. The crisis had tested James in ways that no interview or performance review could have measured. It had revealed not just his technical competence and leadership ability, but his character under pressure. In the most important ways, he had passed that test with the same integrity he'd shown when he returned a wallet full of cash to a stranger dad as he prepared for bed. Richard felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with quarterly profits or stock prices. He'd made a decision that honored his wife's memory, validated his father's example, and recognized the true value of a man who'd never stopped believing that doing the right thing was worth whatever it cost. The phone number on the torn paper in his desk drawer, the number for his daughter, Sarah Elizabeth, seemed less intimidating now. Tomorrow, he decided, he would call her with news of James's promotion and see if she might be interested in meeting the man whose integrity had helped her father remember who he was supposed to be. Some tests reveal character, and some decisions changed lives. Tonight, Richard understood that James Mitchell had passed the most important test of all, the test of leadership under pressure, when people's safety depended on making the right choices quickly and confidently. It was the same test Richard's father had passed every day for 30 years at the community center, and the same test Elizabeth had passed every time she'd chosen compassion over convenience. James Mitchell was ready for whatever came next, and Richard Whitmore was finally becoming the man his family had always believed he could be. The package arrived at James's apartment on a Saturday morning in November, hand-delivered by a courier who seemed surprised to find the recipient in such modest surroundings. Inside the manila envelope was a child's drawing, a crayon picture of a soldier in green fatigues, standing next to a small house with a red door. At the bottom, in careful block letters, someone had written Grandpa's new home and signed it, "Love, Emma, age 7. James stared at the drawing for several minutes before noticing the note attached to the back, written in Sarah's familiar handwriting. "Dad, Emma is so excited to meet you. She's been working on this for weeks. We'll be there Sunday at 2 p.m. Love, Sarah." His hands were shaking as he reached for his phone to call Sarah, but before he could dial, it rang. Richard's number appeared on the screen, and James answered, to find his friend's voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "James, I need to ask you a favor," Richard said without preamble. "My daughter is bringing her family to meet you tomorrow, and I was wondering if you'd consider letting me bring Sarah Elizabeth and her children to meet you at the same time. I know it's a lot to ask, but I think our daughters should meet each other." "And, Richard," James interrupted gently, "slow down. What's happening?" Richard took a deep breath. "Sarah Elizabeth called me this morning. She wants to introduce me to my grandchildren, 2 kids I've never met because of our estrangement, but she's nervous about how it will go. And she suggested that meeting at your place, with your family there too, might make it easier for everyone." James looked at the crayon drawing in his hands, thinking about the 7-year-old granddaughter he'd never met who'd been imagining his new life in pictures. "Of course," he said. "I think that's a wonderful idea." Sunday afternoon transformed James's modest apartment into something that felt like a real home for the first time since he'd moved in. Sarah arrived first with her husband David, a quiet teacher with kind eyes, and Emma, a serious 7-year-old who studied James carefully before announcing that he looked exactly like a grandpa should look. "She's been planning this visit for weeks," Sarah explained as Emma explored the apartment with the focused attention of a child cataloging everything for future reference. She made you a welcome home card, picked out a present, and practiced what she was going to say when she met you. Emma's present turned out to be a small American flag on a wooden stand, which she presented to James with the solemnity of a military ceremony. "Mommy said you were a soldier and you helped keep people safe," she said. "I thought you might want a flag for your new house." James knelt down to Emma's level, feeling his throat tighten with emotion. "This is the most beautiful flag I've ever received," he said seriously. "Thank you, Emma. It's going to have a place of honor on my desk." 20 minutes later, Richard arrived with his own family, Sarah Elizabeth, who looked remarkably like James's Sarah despite their different backgrounds, and 2 children who hung close to their mother with the cautious wariness of kids who'd been told this visit was important but weren't sure why. The introductions were awkward at first. 2 families trying to navigate the complexity of relationships that were simultaneously brand new and deeply meaningful. But Emma, with the social confidence that only 7-year-olds possess, broke the ice by announcing that Richard's grandson, Michael, looked like he might be good at building Lego sets and asking if he wanted to see the pictures she'd drawn of her grandfather's adventures. While the children played in James's living room, the 4 adults gathered around his small dining table, sharing stories and trying to understand how their lives had become so unexpectedly intertwined. "It's remarkable," Sarah Elizabeth said, watching Emma show Michael and his sister the crayon drawing of James's apartment. "6 months ago, none of us were speaking to our fathers. Now here we are, having dinner together and watching our children become friends. Sometimes the best things happen when you stop trying so hard to control everything," Sarah Mitchell replied. "When Dad called me after 3 years of silence, I was terrified. But I was also ready to forgive him, to try to rebuild what we'd lost." Richard and James exchanged glances across the table, both men thinking about the simple act of returning a wallet that had somehow led to this moment. "You know," Richard said, "I keep thinking about what would have happened if James had decided to keep that money. Not just for him, but for all of us. Our daughters would still be estranged from their fathers. These kids would never have met their grandfathers, and none of us would have found our way back to the people we were supposed to be." "Maybe that's the point," James suggested. "Maybe integrity isn't just about doing the right thing for yourself. Maybe it's about the ripple effects, about how one honest decision can change multiple lives in ways you never anticipated." As the afternoon progressed, both families found themselves settling into an easy rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. The children played together with the unconscious ease of kids who hadn't yet learned to worry about social differences, while the adults discovered that they had more in common than their shared experience of family estrangement. Emma appointed herself as tour guide for the apartment, showing everyone the flag she'd given James, now prominently displayed on his desk, the photographs he'd hung on the walls, including the framed newspaper clipping about his military service, and the small kitchen where he'd promised to teach her how to make his famous pancakes. Grandpa was homeless, Emma announced to Michael and his sister with the matter-of-fact directness of a child who'd been told the truth about difficult things. But now he has a house and a job, and he helps people, just like Mommy does. Michael, who was 9 and old enough to understand some of the complexity behind Emma's simple statement, looked at James with the kind of respect usually reserved for superheroes. "Were you really homeless? Like sleeping outside and everything?" "I was," James confirmed, "for 3 years. It was the hardest time of my life, but it taught me some important things about what really matters." "What kind of things?" Michael's sister, 6-year-old Katie, asked with genuine curiosity. James considered the question carefully, looking around the room at the 2 families who'd somehow found their way to each other. "It taught me that having a home isn't about the building you live in. It's about the people who care about you." And it taught me that sometimes when you think you've lost everything, you're actually being prepared to find something better. As the day wound down and both families prepared to leave, Emma made an announcement that surprised everyone. "Grandpa," she said to James, "next Sunday is Thanksgiving, and Mommy said I could invite you to our house for dinner. But I think Mr. Richard and his family should come too, because we're all friends now." Sarah Mitchell looked at her daughter with amusement and pride. "Emma, you can't just invite people to Thanksgiving dinner without asking their parents first. Why not?" Emma asked with 7-year-old logic. "We have a big table, and Daddy always makes too much food anyway. And besides, families should be together on Thanksgiving." Richard felt his chest tighten with emotion at being included so naturally in Emma's definition of family. "That's very kind of you, Emma, but actually," Sarah Elizabeth interrupted, "I think that's a wonderful idea. We usually go to my in-laws, but this year they're traveling. We'd love to join you for Thanksgiving, if you're serious about the invitation." Sarah Mitchell smiled, recognizing the same generous impulse in Emma that had driven her own work with veterans. "Of course, we're serious. David always does make too much food, and it would be wonderful to have everyone together." An hour later, after addresses had been exchanged and tentative plans made, both families headed home with the satisfying exhaustion that comes from important conversations and unexpected connections. James stood in his apartment doorway, watching the elevator carry away the people who'd somehow become his extended family, feeling more grateful than he'd ever thought possible. That evening, he called Tommy Rodriguez at the shelter to share the news about meeting his granddaughter and the upcoming Thanksgiving dinner. Tommy listened with the kind of attention that old friends reserve for life-changing moments. "Man, 6 months ago you were sleeping in the bed next to mine, and now you're planning family dinners with millionaires," Tommy said with wonder. "You think any of this would have happened if you kept that wallet?" James considered the question, thinking about the chain of events that had led from that moment at the bus stop to this afternoon in his apartment. "No," he said finally. "None of it would have happened. Keeping the money would have solved my immediate problems, but it would have created a bigger one. I would have had to live with knowing I was someone I didn't want to be. And now? Now I'm living with knowing I'm someone I can respect, and that's made all the difference." The week leading up to Thanksgiving passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. James threw himself into his work at Whitmore Industries, where his promotion to Director of Operations had opened up new challenges and responsibilities. But for the first time in years, work felt like just one part of a larger, more meaningful life that included family dinners and weekend visits with his granddaughter. Richard, meanwhile, found himself planning his first real Thanksgiving in 5 years. Since Elizabeth's death, he'd treated the holiday as just another day off, usually spending it alone in his study working on business reports. The prospect of sharing the day with his daughter's family and James's family felt both wonderful and terrifying. "I don't know how to be a grandfather," he confided to James during their weekly check-in meeting. "I barely figured out how to be a father, and that didn't go so well the first time around." "I think the key is not trying to be perfect," James replied. "Kids don't need perfect grandfathers. They need grandfathers who show up, who pay attention, who treat them like they matter." Thanksgiving Day dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crisp November air that made everything seem sharper and more vivid. James arrived at Sarah's house early, carrying a bottle of wine and the nervous energy of someone attending his first family gathering in years. The house was warm and welcoming, filled with the sounds and smells of a holiday meal and preparation. Emma greeted him at the door, wearing a turkey-shaped apron and a serious expression that suggested she'd been entrusted with important responsibilities. "Grandpa, I need to show you where you're sitting," she announced, taking his hand and leading him to the dining room. "I made place cards for everyone, and you're next to me and next to Mr. Richard, because you're both grandfathers now." The dining room table had been extended to accommodate 8 people, set with Sarah's good china and decorated with Emma's handmade centerpieces, small turkeys constructed from pine cones and construction paper, each one slightly different, but obviously made with great care. Richard arrived with his family an hour later, carrying flowers for Sarah and looking more relaxed than James had seen him since they'd first met. Sarah Elizabeth immediately joined the kitchen preparations, while Michael and Katie gravitated toward Emma's collection of board games. As they gathered around the table for dinner, David asked each person to share something they were grateful. Oh, it was a tradition in their family, but this year it carried extra weight given the remarkable changes everyone had experienced. Emma went first, her 7-year-old voice clear and confident. I'm grateful that Grandpa found us again, and that he has a nice house now, and that Mr. Richard's kids are fun to play with. Michael followed with 9-year-old sincerity. I'm grateful that Dad and Grandpa Richard are friends again, and that we get to have Thanksgiving with new people. When it was James's turn, he looked around the table at the faces of the people who'd become his family, his daughter and her husband, his granddaughter who'd drawn pictures of his new life, Richard and his family who'd somehow become part of his own story. 6 months ago, I was living in a homeless shelter, convinced that I'd lost everything that mattered, he said quietly. Today, I'm sitting at a Thanksgiving table with my daughter and granddaughter, surrounded by friends who've become family. I'm grateful for second chances, for the reminder that it's never too late to become the person you're supposed to be. Richard's voice was thick with emotion when his turn came. I'm grateful for a friend who reminded me what integrity looks like, and for a daughter who was willing to forgive a father who'd forgotten how to be worthy of her love. As the meal progressed, James watched the easy interaction between the two families and marveled at how naturally they'd come together. Emma and Katie had bonded over their shared love of art projects, while Michael had appointed himself as the official joke teller of the group. The adults found themselves sharing stories and laughter with the comfort of people who'd known each other for years rather than months. After dinner, while the adults cleaned up and the children played in the living room, Emma approached James with a serious expression that he'd learned meant she had something important to say. Grandpa, she said, are you happy now? The question was simple, but it cut straight to the heart of everything James had been feeling since that morning at the bus stop when he'd found a wallet and made a choice that changed his life. Yes, Emma, he said, kneeling down to her level. I'm happier than I've been in a very long time. Good, she said with satisfaction. Because when you're sad, it makes other people sad too. But when you're happy, it makes everyone happy. James hugged his granddaughter, thinking about the wisdom that sometimes came from the mouths of children. She was right. His homelessness and despair had affected not just him, but everyone who loved him. But his recovery and newfound happiness had ripple effects too, touching the lives of people he'd never expected to meet, and creating connections that made everyone involved richer and more complete. As the evening wound down and both families prepared to head home, James realized that this Thanksgiving had given him something he'd never thought he'd have again, the feeling of belonging to something larger than himself, of being part of a family that chose to love and support each other despite their imperfections and past mistakes. The child's drawing that Emma had sent him was still taped to his refrigerator, but now it felt like more than just a granddaughter's art project. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important homes aren't the buildings we live in, but the relationships we build with the people who choose to love us. Flaws and all. The call came on a Monday morning in December, just as James was reviewing the quarterly reports for Whitmore Industries' new consulting division. Margaret's voice on the intercom carried an unusual note of urgency that made him look up from his paperwork immediately. James, you have a visitor in the lobby. A Mr. David Chun from the Department of Veterans Affairs. He says it's regarding a matter of significant importance. James felt his stomach tighten with the familiar anxiety. that any veteran experienced when contacted unexpectedly by the VA. After 22 years of military service and 3 years of navigating the sometimes Byzantine bureaucracy of veteran services, he'd learned that significant importance could mean anything from a routine paperwork update to a life-changing revelation. David Chun turned out to be a man in his 40s with the careful bearing of someone accustomed to delivering both good and bad news to people whose lives hung in the balance of government decisions. He carried a leather briefcase and wore the kind of serious expression that suggested this wasn't a social call. "Mr. Mitchell, thank you for seeing me," Chun said as they settled into James's office. "I'm here representing a special committee that's been reviewing military service records for potential recognition of previously unacknowledged heroic actions." James felt his pulse quicken. "I'm not sure I understand." Chun opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder marked with James's name and service number. "Mr. Mitchell, are you familiar with Operation Eagle Shield, your final mission in Afghanistan?" "Of course," James replied cautiously. "I led that mission in 2008. What you may not know is that the intelligence you gathered during that operation prevented not just the attack on the school you saved, but a coordinated series of attacks that would have targeted civilian populations across 3 provinces. The classified nature of the intelligence meant that the full impact of your actions has never been publicly acknowledged." Chun opened the folder and spread several documents across James's desk. "Mr. Mitchell, the committee has determined that your actions during Operation Eagle Shield warrant the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government." The words hit James like a physical blow. The Medal of Honor, the recognition reserved for actions above and beyond the call of duty, for service members who'd risked everything to save others. He stared at the documents, trying to process what he was hearing. "I don't understand," he said finally. "The mission was classified, but it was still just doing my job. I was following orders, protecting civilians. That's what we were trained to do." "Mr. Mitchell," Chun said gently, "according to the after-action reports, you disobeyed direct orders to retreat when you learned about the planned attacks. You chose to stay and coordinate the evacuation of multiple civilian targets, knowing that doing so would put you and your team in extreme danger." James remembered that day with painful clarity, the moment when command had ordered his unit to pull back to a safer position, and his decision to ignore those orders because he knew that children would die if he followed them. He'd never thought of it as heroic. He'd thought of it as the only choice a decent person could make. "The intelligence you gathered during that extended mission," Chun continued, "allowed coalition forces to prevent attacks that could have killed over 1,000 civilians. The committee believes this represents exactly the kind of extraordinary heroism that the Medal of Honor was created to recognize." James was quiet for several minutes, staring at the documents that would transform his legacy from that of a homeless veteran who'd lost everything to that of a decorated war hero who'd saved thousands of lives. It was vindication on a scale he'd never imagined possible. "What would this involve?" he asked. "A ceremony at the White House, presided over by the president. National media coverage. Your story would become part of the official military history of the Afghanistan conflict, and there would be a substantial financial award. Medal of Honor recipients receive a lifetime pension and various benefits." Chum leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Mitchell, I have to tell you that this is extremely rare. Most Medal of Honor awards are made posthumously or immediately after the heroic action, for the committee to review and recognize actions from 15 years ago represents an unusual acknowledgement of how significant your service was." James thought about what this recognition would mean, not just for him, but for Sarah, for Emma, for all the people who'd been part of his journey back from homelessness. It would validate everything he'd endured, prove that his military service had mattered in ways he'd never known. But as he looked at the documents, James also thought about the veterans he'd met at the shelter, the men and women who'd served with honor but would never receive national recognition. He thought about Tommy Rodriguez, still living at Mercy House, still fighting his own battles with the aftermath of service. He thought about the hundreds of veterans Sarah Elizabeth worked with through Harbor House, people whose heroism might never be acknowledged, but who deserved recognition just as much as he did. "Mr. Chun," James said carefully, "can I ask you something? How many veterans are eligible for this kind of recognition but haven't received it?" Chun looked surprised by the question. "I'm not sure I understand what you're asking. I mean, how many veterans performed similar actions, disobeying orders to save civilian lives, putting themselves at risk to protect others, but whose actions weren't documented or reviewed by your committee?" Chun was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Mitchell, there are undoubtedly many veterans whose heroic actions haven't been fully recognized. The nature of classified operations means that some service will never be publicly acknowledged." James nodded, thinking about the weight of recognition and the responsibility that came with it. What if I wanted to accept this honor not just for myself, but on behalf of all the veterans whose heroism has gone unrecognized? "I'm not sure what you mean." James stood up and walked to his window, looking down at the city where he'd once been homeless and where he now held a position of responsibility and respect. What if, instead of a private ceremony focused on my individual actions, we created something bigger? A recognition ceremony that honored not just me, but the broader community of veterans who've served with distinction. He turned back to Chun, an idea forming that felt both ambitious and right. What if we used this Medal of Honor ceremony as an opportunity to launch a national program supporting homeless veterans, funded by the financial award that comes with the medal? What if we made this about service to others rather than individual recognition? Chun stared at him. "Mr. Mitchell, you're talking about giving away a significant financial benefit and sharing recognition that belongs solely to you. I'm talking about using recognition and resources in a way that honors the true spirit of military service," James replied. "I didn't save those civilians in Afghanistan for personal glory. I did it because it was right. If I'm going to be honored for that service, I want that honor to continue serving others." That evening, James called Richard to discuss the unexpected offer and his emerging thoughts about how to respond to it. Richard listened without interruption as James explained the committee's proposal and his own ideas about transforming individual recognition into community service. "James," Richard said when he finished, "what you're proposing is remarkable. But are you sure you want to give up personal recognition that you've clearly earned?" "I've been thinking about that," James replied. 6 months ago, I would have grabbed at any kind of recognition or financial benefit. But now, having my daughter and granddaughter back in my life, having meaningful work and genuine friendships, those things matter more than medals or money." James paused, looking at the framed photograph on his desk that showed Emma presenting him with the small American flag she'd given him for his apartment. "Richard, I learned something important during my time on the streets. Individual success means nothing if the people around you are still struggling. If I can use this recognition to help other veterans get the support they need, then the medal becomes more than just a symbol. It becomes a tool for change." Richard was quiet for several minutes, and James could almost hear his friend's mind, working through the implications of what he was proposing. "You know," Richard said finally, "what you're describing sounds a lot like what my father did when he founded that community center. Using recognition and resources not for personal benefit, but to serve people who needed help." "Maybe that's the point," James suggested. "Maybe true leadership isn't about accumulating honors or wealth. Maybe it's about using whatever influence you have to make life better for people who are still fighting battles you've already won." The next morning, James called Chun back with his decision. He would accept the Medal of Honor, but only if the ceremony could be expanded to include recognition of broader veteran service, and only if the financial benefits could be used to establish a foundation supporting homeless veterans nationwide. "Mr. Mitchell," Chun said after a long pause, "what you're proposing would require approval from multiple government agencies and significant coordination with veteran service organizations. It's not a simple request." "I understand," James replied. "But if we're going to honor military service, let's honor it in a way that continues to serve. Let's make this medal mean something more than just recognition for one person's actions 15 years ago." As he hung up the phone, James felt the same sense of purpose he'd experienced during his military service, the knowledge that he was working towards something larger than his own interests, something that could make a meaningful difference in other people's lives. The keys to his apartment sat on his desk next to Dext, Emma's drawing, and the small American flag she'd given him. 6 months ago, those keys had represented salvation from homelessness. Now, they represented something different, the foundation from which he could reach back and help others find their own path from desperation to dignity. The Medal of Honor. Committee would need weeks to consider his proposal, but James already knew he'd made the right decision. Some recognitions were meant to honor the past, but others were meant to inspire the future. If his military service was going to be remembered, he wanted it remembered in a way that continued to serve the values that had defined his entire adult life: duty, honor, and service to others who needed help. Whatever the committee decided, James had found something more valuable than any medal: the knowledge that his life had meaning beyond his own circumstances and the opportunity to use his experiences, both the triumphs and the failures, to make the world a little better for people who were still fighting their own battles for dignity and hope. 1 year later, James stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, looking out at a crowd of over 5,000 people who had gathered for the first National Veterans Recognition Ceremony. The morning sun caught the gold detail of the Medal of Honor that hung around his neck, but his attention was focused on the faces in the crowd: veterans from every conflict since Vietnam, their families, and the volunteers who worked tirelessly to support them. The past year had been a whirlwind of meetings with government officials, coordination with veteran service organizations, and the careful work of building something that had never existed before: a national ceremony that honored not just individual heroism, but the collective service of all veterans, especially those whose contributions had been overlooked or forgotten. "Nervous?" Richard asked, joining James at the podium where he would soon deliver the keynote address for the ceremony. "Terrified," James admitted with a smile. "But it's the good kind of terrified, the kind that means you're about to do something important." Behind them on the memorial steps sat a diverse group of veterans who represented the honorees for this year's ceremony. Tommy Rodriguez was there, recognized for his work establishing a peer support program for disabled veterans at Mercy House. Dr. Maria Santos, a Navy medic who'd spent her retirement providing free medical care to homeless veterans, sat next to Colonel William Harper, who'd founded a job training program that had placed over 3,000 veterans in meaningful employment. Each of the honorees would receive the newly created Medal of Service, a recognition that James had worked with Congress to establish specifically for veterans, whose post-service contributions exemplified the continued spirit of duty and honor. The medals were funded by the financial award that had come with James's Medal of Honor, transformed into an endowment that would support veteran recognition and services for generations to come. In the front row of the audience, James could see his family: Sarah and David. Emma, now 8 years old and wearing a dress she'd picked out specifically for the occasion. And next to them, Richard's family. Sarah Elizabeth had helped coordinate much of the ceremony through her work with Harbor House, while Emma had appointed herself as the unofficial photographer for the event, carrying a small digital camera that she wielded with the seriousness of a professional journalist. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced, Please welcome Medal of Honor recipient and Director of Operations for Whitmore Industries, Sergeant James Mitchell. As James approached the microphone, he felt the weight of the moment, not just the formal ceremony, but the journey that had brought him here. 18 months ago, he'd been sleeping in a shelter, invisible to most of the world. Now he stood before a national audience, representing not just his own story, but the stories of thousands of veterans who'd found ways to transform their service into continued contributions to their communities. "Thank you," James began, his voice carrying clearly across the Memorial Plaza. "A year ago, when I was offered the Medal of Honor for actions I took during my military service, I had a choice to make. I could accept that recognition as an individual honor, or I could try to use it as a platform to honor something larger: the continued service of veterans who never stopped believing that their duty to their country and their communities didn't end when they took off the uniform." James paused, looking out at the crowd of faces that represented every branch of the military and every era of American service. Today, we're not here to celebrate one person's actions from 15 years ago. We're here to celebrate the ongoing heroism of veterans who've turned their military training and values into civilian service that makes our communities stronger, safer, and more compassionate. He gestured toward the honorees seated behind him. Tommy Rodriguez, who lost his leg in Afghanistan but found his purpose in helping other disabled veterans navigate the challenges of civilian life. Dr. Maria Santos, who could have enjoyed comfortable retirement but chose instead to provide medical care to those who couldn't afford it. Colonel Harper, who transformed his leadership experience into a program that has given thousands of veterans the dignity of meaningful work. James's voice grew stronger as he continued. These are the real heroes, not because of what they did in uniform, though their military service was exemplary, but because of what they've chosen to do since coming home. They represent the best of what military service can become when it's channeled into continued service to others. In the audience, Emma stood on her chair to get a better view of her grandfather, her small camera clicking steadily as she documented what she'd later describe in her school report as the day Grandpa talked to the whole world about being nice to people who need help. "The foundation we're launching today," James continued, "will support programs like theirs across the country. But more importantly, it will support the principle that heroism isn't a single moment of courage. It's a lifetime commitment to using your strengths and experiences to lift up others who are still fighting their own battles." James looked directly at the camera that was broadcasting the ceremony live across the nation, thinking about the veterans watching from homeless shelters, VA hospitals, and their own living rooms who might need to hear that their struggles were recognized and their potential for continued service was valued. If you're a veteran watching this today, struggling with unemployment, homelessness, addiction, or the invisible wounds of military service, I want you to know something. Your story isn't over. Your service didn't end when you left the military. It just changed form. Every day you choose to keep fighting. Every day you choose hope over despair. Every small act of kindness you show to others who are struggling. That's continued service. That's heroism. As James concluded his remarks and the ceremony proceeded with the presentation of the medals of service, he felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal recognition and everything to do with purpose fulfilled. The event was being broadcast live on multiple networks, but more importantly, it was being watched in VFW halls, homeless shelters, and veteran service centers across the country. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse and the honorees gathered for photographs and interviews, Emma ran up to James with her characteristic 7-year-old enthusiasm. "Grandpa, that was the best speech ever," she announced, throwing her arms around his waist. "I took 100 pictures, and I'm going to put them in a book about why my grandpa is famous." James knelt down to her level, looking into eyes that held the same bright optimism that had once characterized his own view of the world. "Emma, I want you to remember something. I'm not famous because I got a medal or because I gave a speech. I'm proud of this day because we used what happened to me to help other people. That's what real success looks like. Not what you get, but what you give." Emma nodded seriously, then brightened. "Like when you gave back Mr. Richard's wallet, even though you could have kept the money?" "Exactly like that," James confirmed. "Sometimes the most important thing you can do is give something back, even when keeping it would be easier." That evening, both families gathered at Richard's house for a quiet celebration dinner. The formal recognition was over, but the real satisfaction came from sharing the day with the people who'd become his chosen family. The daughter who'd forgiven his failures, the granddaughter who saw him as a hero, regardless of any medals, and the friend whose lost wallet had somehow set in motion a chain of events that had transformed all their lives. Richard stood to offer a toast as they gathered around his dining room table. "A year and a half ago, James returned something to me that I thought I'd lost forever, $50,000 in cash. But what I actually got back was worth far more than money. I got back my relationship with my daughter, my sense of purpose, and my understanding of what it means to live a life of integrity." Richard raised his glass toward James. "But more than that, I got a friend who reminded me that character isn't about what you do when people are watching. It's about what you do when you think no one will ever know." James, what you did with that Medal of Honor, transforming individual recognition into collective service, that's who you've always been. It's why you returned the wallet. It's why you've succeeded in every challenge since then. And it's why this day happened the way it did. As the evening progressed and both families shared stories about the day's events, James found himself thinking about the framed photograph that now sat prominently on his office desk. Not a picture of himself receiving the Medal of Honor, but the photo Emma had taken of all the ceremony honorees together, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling with the satisfaction of people who'd found ways to turn their personal struggles into service to others. The photograph represented everything James had learned about success and meaning over the past 18 months. Individual achievement was satisfying, but collective impact was transformational. Recognition was nice, but purpose was essential. And sometimes the most important thing you could do was use your own second chance to create opportunities for others who were still waiting for theirs later that night. James sat in his apartment looking at the small American flag Emma had given him when they first met, thinking about the journey that had brought him from a bus stop to the Lincoln Memorial, from homelessness to national recognition. The flag still held a place of honor on his desk, not because it represented his personal success, but because it reminded him of the values that had guided every important decision along the way: duty, honor, service, and the belief that doing the right thing was always worth whatever it cost. Outside his window, the city sparkled with the lights of millions of people living their own stories of struggle and triumph, failure and redemption. Somewhere out there were veterans sleeping in shelters, fighting their own battles with poverty and despair. But now, because of the foundation launched today, there were also new resources, new programs, and new reasons for hope. The wallet that had started everything was long forgotten, returned to Richard and spent on whatever wealthy people spent $50,000 on. But the decision to return it, that moment of choosing integrity over opportunity, had created ripples that continued to spread, touching lives that James would never meet, but who would benefit from the programs and services funded by his choice. To transform personal recognition into collective good. James turned off the lights in his apartment and prepared for bed, feeling the deep satisfaction that comes from a life lived in service to something larger than yourself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve, and new chances to demonstrate that character and integrity were more than just ideals. They were practical tools for building a world where everyone had the opportunity to find their way from desperation to dignity, from isolation to belonging, from failure to redemption. The best gifts James had learned, were the ones you gave away. And sometimes, when you gave them freely and without expectation of return, they came back to you multiplied beyond anything you could have imagined in the form of family reunited, friendships forged, and the knowledge that your life had made a difference in ways that would continue long after you were gone.